Welcome, everyone. We're so glad to have you today. We are welcoming you to the ACSM Brown Bag in Science webinar series. We're thrilled to kick off the 2021-2022 year with a presentation by Dr. Brent Ruby. You'll hear more about Dr. Ruby in a minute. First, we want to tell you a little bit about the Brown Bag series. Each year, we use the Brown Bag series to highlight the breadth of research that our ACSM members conduct. So our presenters will give us generally a 25 to 30-minute talk, followed by lots of time for question and answer. So we do hope you have lots of questions today for our presenter. Throughout his presentation, go ahead and type your questions into the question area on the GoToWebinar screen, and we'll take as many questions as possible after Dr. Ruby's talk. We also have a few housekeeping items. If you have trouble hearing or seeing the presentation, it's likely due to your internet connection, so go ahead and log off and log back into the webinar. We will be recording today's presentation, and if you registered for today's session, then within about 7 to 10 days, we will send you a link to the recorded version of today's presentation. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Brent Ruby. Dr. Ruby completed his bachelor's in exercise science from Seattle Pacific University, where he also ran cross country and track. He completed his master's and Ph.D. in exercise science from the University of New Mexico before coming to the University of Montana in 1994. He serves as the director of the Montana Center for Work Physiology and Exercise Metabolism. He has been widely funded by a range of agencies in the Department of Defense. The focus of much of his research ranges from understanding the skeletal muscle interaction with environmental stress during exercise and recovery, the implications of high altitude operations, heat stress injury risk profiling, and reduction and understanding the limits of human work during ultra endurance events. Today, he will be sharing his research from 25 years of working with wildland fire crews. Given the number and severity of wildfires over the past few years, we thought this would be a very timely topic and a terrific way to start off our brown bag season. So again, we want to say welcome to Dr. Ruby, and at this time, I will turn it over to Brent for his presentation.
Okay, I hope everybody can hear me. I'm kind of new to the webinar strategy, but hopefully we can make this happen pretty good. Yeah, when ACSM contacted me and said if I'd be interested in sharing some of the work we've done with fire crews, I was super excited. It's been a really long assignment for me to work with these crews over the years, and just like that, 25 years get accumulated of chasing these folks through the forests of western Montana and the northern Rockies and basically the entire western part of the US. All of this work has been funded in part through research grants from the US Forest Service or from various Department of Defense organizations. And so it's been a real honor to work with all these organizations, but it's especially been an honor to work with the fire crews that we've played with over the years. So in this world of wildland fire, you'll see it in the news quite a bit. And there is quite a colorful cast of characters that make up this elite workforce throughout each annual season, both men and women. And there's a wide range of different types of crews that get formed over the course of the season. There's ground-based crews called hotshot crews, initial attack crews. There's crews that use helicopters, heli-attack crews, and then there are crews that jump out of airplanes into and around the area of the fire, and those are the smoke jumpers. In Missoula, Montana, we have one of the very first smoke jumper centers that was started back in the 40s. So we've got a rich history of fire here in Montana. But it's been such a cool adventure to chase these folks through the forest and get on helicopters with them and follow them into the fires to capture a whole host of all kinds of biosamples and everything in between. But I put this slide up here not to do anything but to kind of overwhelm you with what 25 years worth of peer-reviewed research looks like specific to fire. We've done an enormous amount of work with these crews, and every single bit of it has been unscripted situations. So we're out on the line with them, we hike in with them, we fly in with them, whatever it takes to answer the question. A lot of these studies are descriptive in nature because it's very difficult to manipulate a stable independent variable under these unscripted settings. It's not like we can dial in the temperature and the environment and say, okay, it's only going to last for 3 hours. Most of their most of their shifts will last 12 to 16 hours. So you spend an awful lot of time in the morning when it's dark and cold, and an awful lot of time in the late evening when it's also dark and cold, managing all the data that comes in. We've done work with energy expenditure. We've done work with wearable sensors. We've done work with heat stress, seasonal adaptations, changes in muscle fuel, tried to strategize different ways to feed crews, looked at hydration challenges. We've looked at changes in health across the season. We've tried to address a wide spectrum of topics in pursuit of paving the way to making this occupation a bit more as safe as we can possibly suggest to the agencies. So we started, I love saying we started with this research back in the 1900s because I was wandering across campus the other day and realized, oh my goodness, almost every student here, unless they're a non-traditional student, none of them were born when I started at the University of Montana, which is shocking for me to think about. My very first email was my University of Montana email. And back in the late 90s, we started doing some stable isotope tracer work under these unscripted situations, which had brought with it enormous challenge and expense. And we didn't want to screw it up because these techniques are kind of pricey, and we were using an environment that we didn't know how it was going to work out. But it worked out pretty good. So we did some energy expenditure and water turnover studies initially. And one of the techniques that we have really used with this population is a elegant metric that allows you to calculate total energy expenditure using 2 different stable isotope tracers. I'm going to turn off my webcam so you guys can see all of the slides. I'll turn it back on when we get to the question session. So that way it won't be muddled, the screen won't be muddled by my face. So the energy expenditure with doubly level water is really great because it doesn't require any mouthpieces. It doesn't require any really any gear out in the field, with the exception of an ability to capture urine samples periodically. And so that technique is great because it kind of allows you to break down total energy expenditure across the 3 different components, which is, of course, the basal metabolic rate, which for most humans is their dominant component of total energy expenditure. And then, of course, the small component of dietary induced thermogenesis, and then the most variable component in humans, which is the energy expenditure of physical activity. And in the wildland firefighters, that assumes control of what the overall energy expenditure of the job is. The methodology is dependent on a loss of both of these tracers, and it's proportionate to how much energy is being expended over the course of X number of days. We've used this technique with fire crews across a wide range of different assignments all over the country. And then we've followed up 15 years later with a subsequent study using the same exact technique to see if the work intensities and the expected energy demands were similar, or if the job had changed. Indeed, they are similar. The energy expenditure is pretty dang high, average around 4,000 or 5,000 calories per day, which it's not impossible at all to exercise that hard periodically. These work assignments are typically 14 days on with 2 days off. And it's not necessary that all of these 14-day assignment days are at this high energy expenditure, but they're pretty uniform because this technique averages, basically allows you to quantify the average energy expenditure over X number of days that you're studying, 3 days, 7 days, whatever. And that's kind of the window of time that we're able to chase these crews. So the energy expenditure is high. That was one of our first goals, was to see what we were up against in terms of the energy demands. And that's why we used that technique, and it worked out quite well. Here's a breakdown of the different components. And what I want to highlight more than anything else is across this window of this measurement period, 3 to 5 days basically, they're pretty darn weight stable. So they maintain energy balance despite high levels of energy expenditure in terms of total. But what's more interesting to look at, I think, is the energy expenditure of physical activity and how variable that is depending on the assignment. If you're on a fire in Florida, it's very different than if you're on a fire in the Northern Rockies or on the Western slope of, let's say, Idaho or Western Montana. It's very rocky, the terrain is very steep, and there can be tremendous changes in altitude. But the energy expenditure of physical activity on an average day's assignment is equivalent to carrying a 45-pound pack at a speed of 4 miles an hour for anywhere from 2 hours a day on the very light end up to more than 8 hours a day on a heavier assignment day. And imagine doing that repeatedly over and over for 14 days and then capturing a couple days off and then being on it again on a different assignment. The other thing to consider is the window of work for these elite seasonal workers is about 165 calendar days, and that's between about May through October. However, that they're not always on assignment during that window of time. They're doing project work and some other work perhaps, but it's not uncommon for hotshot crews to accumulate an additional 1,000 hours of overtime, which is the equivalent of another 124-hour, 8-hour shifts. So they put in an enormous amount of time across this 5-month window. California is a different beast, just because it seems like California is always on fire in parts. And so there are new challenges that emerge for those crews in California. But that gives you an idea what the overall physical demands are. Now, we've used this technique in comparison to, I guess, if you want to call them more traditional endurance events, we've compared, used this exact same methodology in these shorter events like Ironman in Kona and then the Western States 100 ultramarathon in Northern California and the Badwater ultramarathon in Death Valley. And there, the energy expenditure using the same technique is considerably different in those events, but they're only sustaining that level of energy expenditure for maybe 24, 48 hours. So Ironman's about 9,000 calories for the race. Western States is a big whopping 16,000 calories. That's in 24 hours. And the Badwater is estimated around 18.5 for about 42 hours or so. So that gives you some perspective. Higher than what firefighters deal with, but these races come and go. They are only a day long. When we look at the work demands of the job with wearables, and the difficulty with any wearable is that it's a wearable, and if you put it on a firefighter, chances are they're going to lose it or break it. And we've lost quite a few sensors that way. Couple that with the fact that a lot of wearables promise the moon and can't measure really what they claim. And so we have a really discerning approach to, we don't want to just put a bunch of junk on these folks. It's got to be valid, useful tools, and it has to not invade their space or make it cumbersome for them to do their real job. And so heart rate monitors have worked pretty darn well. We've used ingestible core temperature sensors. Those are less than completely reliable, and they really don't yield an enormous amount of information unless something goes haywire. Skin temperature sensors, those are kind of interesting when you couple those with heart rate monitors. But this gives you a breakdown in terms of the percentage of the shift that they spend in these higher intensity realms. And you can see that the majority of the work is done at relatively lighter intensities with lower core body temperatures, very little time spent up in the higher sort of red zone in terms of heart rate. And that core temperature rarely encroaches on heat stress oriented levels unless something goes wrong. And it's very important to note that the times when individuals have difficulty in terms of heat stress, it is not coupled with a lack of hydration, and it's also mostly coupled with physical work, the production of heat through physical work rather than the heat from the fire. So that gives you an idea. They don't spend a lot of time in that red zone, but they're smart. They're incredibly well calibrated pieces of equipment in their own right, and they realize that self-regulation and an adequate or a very detailed attention to work to rest ratio is what keeps them out of harm's way. And so regulating that work to rest ratio really provides protection far and above paying attention to whether or not you're getting enough electrolytes or whether or not you're getting enough fluids. And I'll show you some of that data downstream here. So here's another fairly large study that we did using some physiological monitors coupled with some GPS systems. And there's really a wide range of load carriage algorithms out there that can allow you to estimate oxygen consumption. It's very difficult to figure out how to take a portable metabolic system into the field of this crew or this group. It would not work very well. You could use it in a lab setting, no problem. You could use it on a simulated hike, but to take it out onto an actual fire line is risky because it's probably going to get lost or broken, and you don't want to waste that kind of money. So we've estimated the metabolic cost of these load carriage situations in a pretty large sample of fire crews in the past. And Joe Saul works for the Forest Service. He's also one of our doctoral students presently, but he's done a fantastic job of organizing some pretty incredible large-scale field studies that we've done together, and this was one of those. So the thing that's interesting about this is the ingress. I want you to look at the ingress hike. That is, they've arrived on location and they're going to hike into the fire line to start doing their work. That metabolic cost is listed there in terms of the VO2. Interestingly, that VO2 is very, very close to what is expected during their early season workload capacity test. So they have a job qualification task that they have to do. And basically it's carrying a 45-pound pack for 3 miles in under 45 minutes. If they can do that, they can be hired. And there's some argument over whether or not that reflects the job or whether it's not hard enough. And that a lot of that is chatter. Based on the research and all the data that we've collected, that does a pretty good job of estimating whether or not they can do they can meet that metabolic demand of most of the ingress hiking. Hiking with a load is generally the hardest metabolic task that these crews deal with on a day-to-day basis. Now you can see that in training, there are some times when they reach quite a bit higher than that with some of their training hikes, and I'll point you to those numbers here in a little bit, about 34 mLs per kg, and that's that will show you soon how dialed these crews are in terms of knowing what's required of them. So the preseason training appears to be a bit more aggressive than what they expect to find most of the time during the shift, their typical shift. What we've also noticed is some changes in body composition over the season, but I really want to point you to some of these other data, which are changes in oxygen consumption, say peak VO2, which is less interesting than the ventilatory threshold or sustainable fitness. And on the far, I guess, right side of the screen there, where you see VO2 ventilatory threshold, those are data from a variety of crews, mostly hotshot crews and one type 2 crew. But what you notice at the onset of the season is tremendous heterogeneity across these crews of, say, almost 20 subjects. 20 individuals make up a crew, like a hotshot crew. So you see a lot of heterogeneity, and you see some people come in with very high ventilatory threshold metrics and some that come in with lower metrics. But what's incredible is how well-defined and how homogeneous the crews become at the end of the season, working as a unit. As you see in those pictures, they're always together. They're always hiking together. They're digging line together. And so you're only as fast as your weakest link, and which is unfortunate for the folks that show up with a fairly high aerobic capacity and ventilatory threshold at the onset of the season. They showed some detraining, and the other folks have to work their way up to the standard. And what's interesting is these numbers here, what the ventilatory threshold navigates to is almost identical to what we've measured in some of those training hikes. And so it's as if crews realize that periodically we're going to have to step it up to this load, this metabolic load, and so they train accordingly. It's absolutely awesome. So that's one area. The other area is there's a fear, it seems, within the media that, oh my gosh, these wildland firefighters, the environment is hot, they must suffer tremendously from dehydration. And so we have done a lot of different studies with measures of water turnover, which is a more dynamic metric than just simply taking specific gravity of urine samples. And so we want to look at how the body water shifts over the course of, say, a 5 to 7 day assignment. And in this particular study, which was one of our first water turnover studies, in a 5-day window, their body weights shifted about 1 kilogram, and their calculated total body water with this dilution technique also was compromised by about 1 liter. When you look at their water turnover, though, for that 5 days of work, which was about 5,000 calories a day energy expenditure, the water budget was 35 liters in total, so about 7 liters per day to maintain fluid balance. And at the end of the assignment in this 5-day window, they only came up 1 liter shy of maintaining that fluid balance, which is pretty darn impressive because these crews are not running around with a graduated cylinder and a body weight scale, checking and checking and checking each other to make sure that they're maintaining hydration. They're doing it based on experience, thirst, and more experience. And they're incredibly capable of maintaining fluid balance without any attention to anything other than thirst, which is impressive. And so the concept of dehydration in these crews is pretty overblown by the media. We also have looked at thermal balance or thermal strain relative to energy demands and energy expenditure and water turnover in this particular study. And the water turnover in this particular study was more like 9.5 liters per day. So anywhere from about 7 to about 10 liters per day is the fluid demands of the job. But these crews easily meet that with regular attention to just regular intake. They leave camp with typically 4 to 6 liters, and then they can resupply on the line periodically. And that also is not inclusive of what they can consume at the onset when they start the day in the fire camp, and then when they return. So that gives you an idea that that's not too big of a deal. And the reason we're confident in that is because it's not just one study that we've done with this measure. We've done this across several studies, and this amounts to about 220 work days in these individuals, and the average is about 7.5 liters every 24 hours. That's a 24-hour value to maintain fluid balance. There are companies that want crews to believe that it's imperative that they consume supplemental sodium to better maintain hydration status, but I would challenge any of those companies any day with this data, because none of them have collected data out in the field with these crews. And this is an example of where you just can't supplement or superimpose simulated laboratory studies onto the working world of these crews. We have seen one case study. This is a published case study in Wilderness and Environmental Medicine of an individual that went down with heat exhaustion. And this was a hydration study that we were doing with a regulated Camelback system that had a digital flow meter embedded in it that the Army had developed, and we used that with this study. We were mostly interested in the consumption patterns of fluid across whether or not they were provided with electrolyte, additive, or just water. That was the main intent of this study. Well, one of the subjects went down with heat exhaustion. It's the only time we've ever seen that while we've been monitoring other things. So you can get a sense from the internal core temperature measure. His core temperature shot up to the point of collapse. He collapsed on the line. He was treated very rapidly by his other crew members to cool him off. He was evacuated via helicopter, taken to the hospital, and he was back in fire camp that evening. He did not work the next day, but he recovered absolutely just fine. But you can see leading up to that injury, his drinking volume was as high or darn close to as high as what we would expect to see as a 24-hour value. The total number of drinks he consumed there, we have that because of the digital flow meter, the average size per drink, and the mean time between drink. All of those occurred prior to that heat injury. So in the 2 hours leading up to that collapse, he consumed almost 2.5 liters. He was also exposed to a very hot ambient temperature. He was working very close to the fire. And when you couple that with the metabolic heat of digging line with a Pulaski tool, there's nowhere for that heat to go. It can't be evacuated effectively off the body because the environment is pushing back too hard. And so it accumulates and it accumulates. And if it doesn't slow down, then he's going to overheat, which is exactly what happened. The main point of this data was that we use this data all the time when we talk to crews to say that you need to pay attention to hydration. But more than that, you need to pay attention to your work to rest ratio, because you cannot drink yourself to safety. You're not going to drink yourself away from a heat related injury if the work to rest ratio is not appropriate. If you're working too damn hard for that environment, no matter what you do in terms of fluid intake, you're going to be in harm's way. And that's a serious message. This is the last little bit I'll show you, but this is a real recent study with energy intake. So we're real particular on how we measure energy intake. We assign a firefighter researcher with each subject, and they walk around all day with a tablet, like an iPad, and record the food items that were consumed and when they're consumed. And I think most of the most compelling information with this is how often they eat, the number of eating episodes that they accumulate and what each one of these episodes looks like. But when you look at the sodium intake over the course of the overall day, so we have there the breakfast, the dinner, and the overall daily total, 6,500 milligrams of sodium in a day, which is approaching very closely what the average individual during Ironman and Kona might consume to maintain fluid balance and electrolyte balance. And so these data, coupled with some blood data that we have recently in a paper that we're just about ready to submit, there's no changes in serum sodium across the shift on average. They get plenty of it. So the idea that they need supplemental sodium and lots of it is a moot point when you have to consider what their dietary patterns are over the course of the day. And with this sodium intake, we've shown this over and over in different studies. The last thing I'll talk about is this discrepancy that we're starting to notice across the season. And so this is a hard-working job. I've shown you those data. The energy expenditure certainly exceeds what the American College of Sports Medicine would say would be enough exercise to keep you healthy. The problem is these crews don't stay healthy over the course of the season. And this is a project that we did with fire crews in Alaska outside of Fairbanks. And this is with a colleague of mine, Trey Coker from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. He and I have worked together on some of these projects over the last few years, and we're developing this difficult to understand paradigm. And this is the first data along those lines. So we have seasonal measures of body composition, both with the DEXA, and then we also have whole body MRI to look at changes in the skeletal muscle and also the hepatic triglyceride, along with blood samples. So body weight goes up, fat mass goes up. There's no change in lean tissue mass. These folks maintain energy balance based on body weight. They may take in more than they expend over the course of the season. There's no change in cross-sectional area of the muscle from the MRI. Total cholesterol goes up. Low density lipoproteins go up. Intrahepatic lipid goes up. That's not good. No change in HDLs. And when we finish this study, we're sort of left scratching our heads thinking, is this a dietary issue? Are these environmental factors? What's causing this change? And this is an extremely complex work environment where the work is hard, the hours are long, stress is very real, smoke inhalation is periodic and heavy at times, sleep is compromised, and even if I mention stress, it needs to be mentioned again, because most of these crews are away from family for 14 days at a time, and then they come back for 2 days, trying to assimilate into a young family and then bouncing out again to a new assignment. And all of that stress coupled together, we think is contributing to these abnormal metabolic and cardiovascular health discrepancies or disparities across the season. So we've spent a long time talking about or trying to develop all of these things that we know about these crews. We know what they carry. We know what their aerobic capacity. We know how to feed them better. We know what the aerobic demands are. We know what their body composition demands and what those change. We know the fluid demands. We even have measured muscle glycogen changes over the course of the shift. Certain ration systems don't work well for maintaining those. We know about muscle recovery. There's, however, a lot of things that we don't know. We don't know about the cognitive load. We don't know much about the muscular strength demands. Those are hard to measure out here. So we're sort of left scratching our heads. Where do we go from here? These are the areas that we really don't know a lot about. The comprehensive stress is enormous and underappreciated and definitely underrated. when I talk to crews over and over, and being in this world of work for as long as I have, I've seen crew members grow up from a rookie to 20 plus years in the agency. And a lot happens to a person in that many years. They meet somebody, then that person becomes more special, and then it becomes real serious. And then there's children involved. And when you layer this work to time off job schedule in that world, it becomes very difficult for these folks. And my heart goes out to them because I see them developing these stresses over the course of their career. Now, don't get me wrong, I know plenty of old jumpers, and I know jumpers in their 80s and 60s that are no worse for wear and have been essentially badass their whole life and continue to be so. But when you look across the entire spectrum of these crews, there are stresses that go unnoticed, and we need to pay attention to those. So one thing that I decided, my colleagues were shocked by this concept, I think, but that's nothing new. I decided to write a children's book when COVID, well, I started before, but COVID kind of sealed the deal because I had some spare time on my hand. So I wrote a children's book about a unique fire crew, and the goal of this is to sort of maybe share stories with young families and have fire crews be able to communicate a little bit better with their children or grandchildren or nieces or nephews. And so I've never written a children's book before, but this is my first go at it. So it's been an awesome adventure, and it's been well received by the fire community. But we can take some questions. That's my email address. Feel free to contact me anytime at the university. Rango and Banjo, my two border collies that are the main characters in that book. That's our website. You can check out the book and the reasons why in the world I decided to do that on that website. I have to shamelessly plug it because I don't have a publisher that's going to do it for me. So thanks very much for having me. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Brent. That was awesome. And I can confidently say you are the first brown bag presenter who has also written a children's book. So congrats. That's a first for us too. That was an amazing presentation. It really sort of puts some context to the things that we see on the news, particularly here in the Midwest, where we don't necessarily see firsthand wildfires as much as some of the other folks do. So this has been really great, really informative. So I want to encourage everyone at this point, go ahead and enter some questions into the GoToWebinar portal if you have questions for Brent. And Brent, I'm going to start with a question. So when you think about the physiological load, how do those differ for a wildland fire or a forest fire versus a structural fire?
That's a really good question. And a lot of times people have a tendency to lump the research that we do with wildland crews in with the world of the structural firefighter and vice versa. It's two very different beasts. It'd be like trying to compare a football team with a cross-country running team. There's a lot more power-oriented tactics, and the work of the structural firefighter is much more shorter assignments with longer rest breaks because they're limited by the equipment. And there's an enormous amount of work that's been done with the world of the structural firefighter. But the wildland folks, very different because their assignments don't last for an hour. They're 12 to 24 hours on assignment. And then they rotate off, have a night's sleep that's likely going to be compromised, and then they're back on the assignment the next day. So in terms of the metabolic cost, if you were to measure that, there would be certain similarities, but the wildland firefighters' work shift is way longer. on average in a 24-hour window of time.
Awesome, thank you. So what about, our participant has asked that it appears that a lot of the research has been done on hotshot crews. What about engine or dozer crews?
It's a great question. That's a great question. That is one thing that we can, with some confidence, superimpose some of these results onto those other crew types because the work duration might be similar. But with like a dozer crew or an engine crew, you don't anticipate the same amount of hiking and load carriage perhaps. And so some of the job assignments will be a little bit lighter in terms of the aerobic demand, but those might get substituted with some higher intensity windows like dragging a hose or setting a hose, like a hose lay, or moving heavier equipment. So the makeup of those crews might be a little bit different in terms of where their strengths are. They're not going to be the aerobic characters that a hotshot crew might be or a jumper crew, but they're going to have their own skills and talents. But we have not done a lot of work with those. We have not, none of our research has focused on dozer crews and or engine crews yet.
Great. Can you describe at all sort of the off-season training that these folks do to try and stay in shape?
There's a wide range of strategies and tactics that some of these crews use. It's important to note that the majority of the folks on these assignments, on these hotshot crews, the majority of them are seasonal workers. And so they're paid for the time they're on the crew, which might be 5 months or so. But the Forest Service or the BLM or other agencies aren't paying them in the off season. And so they walk a fine line between knowing full well that the job's going to require a pretty high level of fitness, yet they're not getting compensated for maintaining that. Hotshot crews, though, and jumper crews and helitack crews, their level of professionalism and dedication to the job is unmatched. And so they know that what they need to do is maintain an active lifestyle during that off season. One of the hardest days I've ever had downhill skiing, I've skied my whole life, was with members of Northern California hotshot crew that spend a lot of their time outside of Truckee, California, skiing, a lot of skiing. And they skied my legs off that day. And so they're creative in how they maintain physical activity. But a lot of them are endurance athletes. A lot of them ski. A lot of them take big, awesome vacation trips during the off season. But they're just, the job is a very active job, and they know that. And so they do a really good job for the most part of maintaining that level of fitness.
Great. So you mentioned quite a bit about nutrition and hydration and the needs in the field over these extended periods of time. So like, what do these folks eat and how often do they eat so that they can maintain energy balance?
That's a good question. Most of the time, in the typical non-COVID world of fire, they would work in and out of a fire camp. And so there's a caterer on staff that can feed hundreds of individuals. And so they're fed a breakfast, usually a hot breakfast, and the same with a dinner after they come off the shift, which could be 12 hours or more. When they leave the shift, what they used to take was what would be called a sack lunch. A lot of people still use the term sack lunch. I try to steer people away from that concept because the idea of a sack lunch means you're going to sit down and eat the whole thing at one time when it's lunchtime. And that's the wrong way to consume macronutrients and nutritional support during the shift. You need to take it in like other endurance athletes periodically throughout the day. And so we've tried to shift the focus to shift provisions. So what are the shift provisions that they take on the day? And those need to be spaced out over a wide breadth of eating episodes, ideally about 6 to 8 eating episodes over the course of that 12-hour window. And recognizing through RPE and just general perception of how hard the work is, manage that intake, especially the intake of carbohydrate sources accordingly. So when the work output is stepping up, you plan ahead and you have those provisions accessible. There's a million different pockets on these uniforms, and so they will put supplemental foods of all sorts in those pockets. Same thing with drinking. Obviously, frequent drinking is recommended, but we did a lab-based study recently where we manipulated the fluid intake to just large boluses each hour versus lots of small drinks. And there was no difference in thermoregulation or overall hydration status. And so the message we can translate to these crews is, if the fluid demand is about 8 liters a day, 7 liters a day, getting that in, you're not going to get that in at the beginning and the end. You have to trickle it through all through the day. But if you're busy with a chainsaw and you can't take a drink for an hour, you can make up for it with a larger bolus at the end of that hour. And so those are the general recommendations that we tend to work into our educational material, I would say. There's no magic bullet. When we started, really one of the only food bars available was granola bars and power bars. Now there's 1,000 different bars available, and no matter how good they are the first time you eat them, if you eat a carrot cake freaking Cliff Bar for 7 days in a row, you're done. I'm done with those for the whole season. Can't do it anymore. So variety is very important.
I can imagine. Oh, that's a great answer. So we have a participant whose husband is a wildland firefighter, and she said they live at sea level, and she's wondering if you've considered research on acclimation from low to higher elevation when that has to happen quickly.
Yeah, that can be a challenge, especially if they live at sea level and then they're bumped up above 7,000 feet, which can happen. We've been on plenty of fires in Idaho where we're at about 9,000 feet or so in outside of the Salmon River area. And there is no, the operation is, and the fire itself is unforgiving in terms of allowing or accommodating that acclimation period. It would be nice, but they're not going to be able to get it. And so, like heat stress, like any of these environmental stressors, the greatest thing a crew member can bring to day one of the job is a high level of aerobic fitness. That is the end-all protective strategy that seems to never fail, because the work assignment, even at that higher altitude or even in the hottest conditions, it will be stepped back accordingly in terms of intensity. And so starting the season with a high level of aerobic fitness, the ability to carry a pack for long periods of time, the ability to sustain metabolic loads between 25 and 35 mLs per kg, which running is a fantastic way to do that. Trail running and carrying a load. Those are the best, most specific training strategies these crews can probably do. It's not uncommon here in Missoula to see all the hiking trails around Missoula. I mean, we hike with these border collies all the time, and as the season gets closer, we'll see guys out there by themselves, saw on their shoulder, hiking up Mount Sentinel, which starts at about 3,500 feet and gets to about 5,000 feet, and that's just outside of our back door at the university, outside the lab. And so we use that mountain all the time for training and testing. But bring a high level of aerobic fitness to the table, and that provides that protection so that you can get away with not having to fully worry about acclimating to that high altitude. For that person that asked that question, send me an email and I'm sending you one of these Rango and Banjo books.
You might get a lot of emails if you're giving out books.
Hey, if a firefighter family member asks a question like that, I'm sending you a book.
Awesome. We did have a question. We were wondering if you also did the cartoons for your book.
Oh, no, I wish so badly I had that artistic skill. I worked with an awesome artist. I worked with an awesome artist that I found out of the Chicago area, and he was absolutely fantastic in helping me out. But the illustrations and the whole story is very fire centric. I worked with a couple of retired jumpers as my critical eye to make sure chin straps were in order and personal protective gear was appropriately represented, et cetera. So I had a wonderful time working with that artist, though.
That's awesome. So given that the fire seasons have gotten longer, and currently we're experiencing a situation where, I don't know, they keep telling us on the news this could last till November. Over the years that you've been doing this research, have you seen crews working more days per year than when you started your research?
Surprisingly, not really. I mean, it goes in waves. And so some seasons will be longer than others, but we have not noticed a change in the overall shift operation duration. What you do notice most definitely is the severity and the size of the fires. Those definitely seem to be influenced by whatever. I mean, there's all kinds of political thoughts on forest management and just years of suppression and whatever. That's way outside of my wheelhouse. But the crews themselves, the total number of hours seem to be close, and that's just a rough estimate. I mean, folks within the agency can answer that a lot better. But the thing that I have noticed that is most difficult to deal with is the stress level of the crews is not the same. It's not the same. And there are organizations on the grassroots level that are really taking strong steps towards legislation to make this job safer and more equitable in terms of compensation that's necessary for these elite working forces. And I'm ready to step up and help those groups anytime our data can. And I think we have more data than anybody else in the world with crews on the ground. And it's heartbreaking as a physiology researcher to not have the tools to be able to manage the cognitive and psychological stresses that accumulate. I don't have the countermeasures for that. If a children's book can help, I hope that maybe it can a little bit, but I'm at my rope's end as far as where my tools can take me. And we're trying very hard to work with other clinical folks that have those strengths so that we can better understand what countermeasures need to be inserted or could be inserted during the season and especially in the off season, and tools that help families, which are the #1 support system of these folks. It's one thing to tell these fire crews how to eat, drink, and train. It's another thing to work with psychological health and well-being, and that needs much more attention.
Yeah,
So there's
I
a
think
challenge for all the listeners. If there are students out there clamoring for research ideas, coupling your physiology with some other metrics is really important to consider.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, sometimes our brown bag webinars really lend themselves to this, and I think yours does in particular. I mean, it sounds like there's an opportunity for collaboration with other types of scientists, right? Cognitive scientists, behavioral scientists, psychologists. So we have all of those areas at ACSM. under the umbrella of kinesiology. So who currently works with you? What folks go with you on sort of these research runs? Do you take graduate students? Do you take registered dietitians? Is it what is the group that goes out into the field to collect data?
We've done all of those. We've done all of those, although it was a lot easier in the earlier days where we would contact crews and just head out with them and maintain cell communication while we were traveling. It was a lot easier back then. The agencies have been a lot more tight on access to these crews, and I think rightfully so. Not just anybody can swoop into a fire camp and start taking muscle samples or blood samples or giving out stable isotopes anymore. It takes a coordinated effort with agency-sponsored teams. And so the agency has different research teams that they assemble, some of which are former firefighters, and those get partnered up with different scientists, and it becomes a real close-knit, comprehensive group with a lot of different tools and capabilities, from communication to the science and the equipment. But in years past, we had a really simple approach to collecting data in the field. Now, when we go out in the field, we bring an arsenal of equipment. We have multiple trailers, all of which are solar capable, so that if we needed to get samples, we can get those in those trailers. We can process them, store them, do all those things, which is difficult to do in the field. But working with the psychological sort of realm, we have not established those collaborations yet. There are some folks within the agency, former operators, former hotshots, that have done advanced studies in psychology, and they've done some really amazing work. But more of that needs to be done, no doubt.
All right, we have time for one more question. So one of our participants is asking, due to all the data and the knowledge that you've accumulated over all of these years, if you were put in charge for a season, what changes would you implement to improve the health and performance of the firefighters?
Man.
That's a good one, huh?
That is a good one. I would establish a comprehensive educational program that would provide crews with the most updated science, and I would provide it in a way that they could appreciate it and comprehend it and apply it. There's a tendency for scientists to over-science everything and lose their audience even before they start talking. And so a comprehensive educational program would be massive. And also to provide access to resources from whatever those resources might be. It could be, here's all the different countermeasures and here's how to tap into them. We can get you these pro deals on this food. We can get you all these supplies for very little to make your job that much better. There's a support system for when you're not on assignments. There's support systems for families. There's off-season support systems for crew members that get forgotten when they're dropped off of a crew at the end of the season. What do they do now? And that's difficult. So that's what I would do, is I would try to put all that stuff together. Notice how I didn't say I would develop the perfect electrolyte beverage. I would not spend any money trying to do that. That we know all that stuff. We need to train and take care of these people better than rather than develop the perfect silver bullet so that they don't get dehydrated, because that's less and less of an issue. So I don't know if that's the right answer, but that's the one I'm sticking to.
That sounds like a good place to start, for sure. Well, thank you again, Brent. This has just been a great hour, and we really appreciate your time. We really enjoyed your presentation. So at this point, we're going to say thanks to all of you for participating today. We'll be back at the end of October for our next next in the series of the brown bag webinars. So everyone have a great day, and thanks again, Brent, and thanks to all of you for participating. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.